Good evening. I will now call the September 27th, 2022 meeting of the Ben Lapine School Board of Directors to order. I'd like to introduce our participants this evening. To my immediate left is Director Marcus LeGrand, Vice Chair Marcus LeGrand, and Director Shirley Olson. Joining us remotely are Director Amy Tatum and Director Shamiko Montgomery. To my immediate right is Superintendent Steve Cook, Deputy Superintendent Laura Nordquist, and Board Clerk Janet Bojanowski, and I am Melissa Barnes-Delakia, Chair of the Board. We are joined by Aaron Trimble and Kayla Celadon tonight for ASL interpretation, and closed captioning and a live Spanish interpretation are available on our BLS School Board YouTube page. We'll now move to item number 2, the Pledge of Allegiance. Would you please stand, remove your hats, and join me for the pledge?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. We'll now move to item number 3, which is the review of the agenda. Are there any changes to the agenda?
There are no changes to the agenda.
Fellow board members, are there any requests for changes to the agenda? Great. Hearing no request, the agenda will proceed as stated. A note for our stakeholders: we do not take public comment during our board work sessions. This is an opportunity for the board to engage in discussion on key board work and initiatives. We'll now move into our work session. During this time, we are very excited to be able to be joined by Dave Van Loo, who is our Director of School Improvement, who will be sharing with us information on our board ends and taking us through a workshop to be able to reach consensus on how we're going to measure the goals that we've put forth as a board and as a cabinet for Ben Lapine Schools.
All right, thank you. So my first question, I guess, do the remote people have all of the same materials? Okay, good, that would be important. Oh, sorry, one second. All right, there you go, sorry, Dave. Not a problem. So I'm just going to kick this off with a handful of slides to set the stage, and then we'll actually dig into the work session itself. We talk a lot in schools and just in organizations in general about data, and I think what I really want to stress tonight is, in general, we do not care much about data. What we care about is evidence. So data are simply, it's numbers, it's percentages, it's statistics, it's just things that are out there. But they really have no meaning until we assign our own inferences, our own assumptions, our own judgments, our own biases, our own conclusions to those. So when we're talking about board ends and the metrics that measure those, what we really want to be talking about is evidence, not just data. So we want to move from just data to this idea of data that's actually relevant and furnishes proof that supports a conclusion. And the conclusions we're trying to support, we're going to talk about board ends 1 through 3 tonight, which relate to, 1 is around academic excellence, number 2 is largely about graduates being future ready, and the third one largely has to do with culture and climate of our school buildings. So the question that we're really trying to dig into tonight is, are the data that we have really high quality evidence of how well our district and how well our schools are achieving those ends? So on this second slide here, again, what really matters is how appropriate our inferences, assumptions, and conclusions are that we base our decisions and our judgments on. And in the red box there is really the big takeaway or goal for the night. So to wrestle with this idea of, do the proposed metrics provide clear evidence of schools' impact in advancing the corresponding board ends? I've got some notes here. I want to make sure, there's a lot going on tonight, so I want to make sure I don't miss anything. one way I would describe this is data is really, when used well, it's about telling stories. It's about telling meaningful and correct stories. So we want the metrics that are supporting each end to really provide a clear and compelling story for what that end is trying to measure. So if we run into a situation where the data or the metric that we're looking at is unrelated to the end or only partially related to the end, or if there's situations where what the data that's in the end is substantially beyond the control of what schools can actually impact, or if we end up in situations where there's multiple reasonable explanations for how the data are linked to the end, those all create a pretty grave danger that the metric isn't going to be a very good measure for systemic organizational improvement. So what we're really trying to do is align this story and make sure that you as board members feel highly confident that these are data that you believe in, you support, you think these are a great measure of what we're looking for from our district and from our schools. So here's just a few examples of inferences, assumptions, conclusions that people could draw. This certainly isn't comprehensive, but so there's ideas around direction. I'll combine the first two, direction and level. Anytime we do a key performance indicator and we ascribe a number to it, people are going to make assumptions around direction and about level. So what's our target? What are we trying to shoot for? Where are we right now? Does this number need to go up? Does this number need to go down? Does it need to stay the same? Those are clear. 99.9% of people are going to arrive at those types of inferences when they look at quantitative data. But there's also inferences that pertain to, say, reliability and validity. So are the data actually a high quality measure of the thing that we are trying to measure in our board end? There's questions around action or impact. So do the data actually help support or point to specific actions that we would take that are going to drive meaningful improvement? You have questions around scope. Who does this apply to? Does this apply to all students or some students? All staff, some students? Is it just high school students? Is it elementary students? Is it this subgroup but not that subgroup? So there's always questions around who does this actually capture? And ultimately, these speak to our values. So when we choose these metrics, we're making a statement around what we believe in and what we stand for. So to make this a little bit more, concrete, here's the same slide, and all I did was plugged in state testing scores. So if you just think about that, if we're using state test scores as one of our metrics, should these scores be increasing, decreasing, or unchanging? It's probably pretty obvious. What's our goal or what's our target? What percentage of students should be passing these tests? The third one is quite interesting. Our OSAS score is a high-quality measure of academic excellence. You will find people who will argue both sides of that vehemently. So if we want to stand behind something like that, we should be pretty confident in that. Our OSAS scores, do they help inform specific actions that will drive meaningful improvement? What's the purpose? What's the benefit of using these? Do we care equally about state test scores for all students, all demographic groups, all grade levels, some grade levels? And then finally, what does our use of state test scores say about what we value and what we believe in as an organization? So just a quick summary again. Board End 1 is about a strong academic foundation, and the metrics that we are talking about here in our draft they're measures of academic success from spanning kindergarten through 12th grade. For board end number 2, when we're talking more about the passion and plan and purpose for their future, that idea of students being future ready, most of those measures are focused at the end of high school or at some point in high school. Those are going to relate to more what are our graduates prepared to do once they're at the end of their K-12 experience. And then board end 3, most of the metrics are going to try to tap into these ideas around measures of school climate and school culture. And the way I would separate those, climate has a lot to do with the way the school feels, and culture has a lot to do with the way we do things at the school, especially the way the adults things do at the school, because that then conveys to students the way that they should be doing things. So culture is a lot about what are our shared beliefs and what are our values. So board N3 really has to do with, do we have cultures and climates that support wellness, inclusion, and belonging for all of our stakeholders? A couple other things to mention about these ends. We've explicitly built equity into all of these. In the past, sometimes what we've done is we've had a measure of state test scores, these different measures, and then there would be one measure around historically underserved student groups. These are different because a comparison between the overall population and historically underserved students is baked into every single measure. So everything that we say we care about, we want to know, do we have gaps in that we need to pay attention to and address as well. So equity and engagement are really built into all of these. And again, the last one in red, can't stress enough, this is really about focusing on what are the things that schools have substantial control over, because there's a lot of things that we can measure that we know are related to the ends, but we want to focus on things that tell us as an organization, give us feedback as to what we're doing well, what we're not doing well, and how we can actually improve outcomes for students. So that is the end of the slides. Janet, have you passed the materials out? Okay, so we're going to spend the rest of the time doing this activity, and you should have a copy of the draft board ends, which should have less writing on them than mine, I hope. And then you also have this packet, which is the activity for the night. And the plan is, let me get my notes back. Again, the big idea here is going to be thinking critically about the stories that the proposed metrics tell about the ends that we're trying to achieve. So what I had planned was we would tackle each of the three ends one at a time, and I'll start by just giving you a brief overview of what the proposed metrics are, make sure you understand what we're trying to measure, why that's in there. Then the plan was to break folks off into pairs, so we'll have to figure out how we want to tackle this. But then to dig into going along with the ends, for each of the ends, there's a page that lists some of the possible inferences, assumptions, conclusions that people are likely to draw from looking at, from using these particular ends. So we've got the inferences and we've got some key questions, and really the activity is to reflect on these key questions and think about what are the key inferences, assumptions, and conclusions that are present in this. Are these the types of inferences we want people drawing? And again, ultimately, it's this idea of, do we stand behind the idea that these are high-quality metrics of how well our system is doing at what we want to excel at. So after you've had a chance to look at that, then I was thinking we could just get back together. We could, share our thoughts, discuss, hopefully form some conclusions about whether to go forward with these or whether more work needs to happen. And then we can just do the same process with end 2 and with end 3. And really, I view this as your discussion. I see myself as being here for support, and I'm sure Dr. Cook and Laura as well can support you as well. But this is your discussion as a board, so I just want to make this as successful as possible. Are there any questions before we?
Dave, before we get going on this, can you take us just through kind of the proposed metrics just a little bit on this document?
Yes.
Before?
Yeah, that's my plan. So for each one of the three, I'll go through it.
Got that.
Just at a higher level, not focusing on just end 1 at this point, but a few things to keep in mind. Everything on this page we view as fluid, and the ends are designed to be adaptable and flexible. Partly that's because a lot of the ways that are the best ways to measure success are things that are outside of our control. So there's test blueprints, cut scores change. Oregon Public Universities might change their admission requirements. ODE might change the graduation requirements for a high school diploma. And even how we define and think about different demographic groups can change. So I want to be explicit about that up front, just knowing that there's a lot coming at us that's going to change, so we want to make this as flexible as possible. But a big idea then in this is to provide a general framework that we can use to really just present the best available evidence for whether we're meeting those ends. A second big idea is that we're focusing on what schools are able to control. I guess we view schools' job is to prepare students to succeed at whatever they choose. So this is really about, are we setting students up to be able to do whatever they want to do when they leave? But these metrics that we're proposing here are highly focused on what happens in K-12, not what happens prior to kids entering school, and not as much what happens when kids leave 12th grade. And a third thing that is well worth mentioning and keeping in mind, another key idea here is to make sure that the data are actually data that we can get and track, because that's a really, really big challenge. So everything in here, we're reasonably confident that we can build the infrastructure and the systems to be able to track these data with a high degree of confidence. Steve, did you want to?
Yeah, and I would just like to add, we had a tremendously valuable conversation about those things that might be measured on this document aren't the only things that we would be measuring and reporting on, but these are the ones that we would propose arguably make the most sense as evidence points for each of those specific outcome goals. So it doesn't mean we don't care about all the other stuff. It just means these are the most aligned to those goals.
Can I ask a clarifying question, please?
Sure.
In looking at what you want to do in terms of the board, and how clear, in terms of our messaging to people within the schools, students, families, in terms of them, allow them to know what we're doing in terms of this, where is that impacted in this, where is that at? Because I think a lot of times if people don't know the clear understanding of what you're doing and people don't have buy-in and have an understanding, it makes it a little bit difficult to be able to maybe try to do that. Where we're at in that process is a part of this.
So to my knowledge, we haven't done a lot of messaging to staff specifically about what, they know what, I would say what the ends are, the ideas around academic excellence and future ready and climate and culture. How we define the metrics for success, there's some of them that are obvious. I think whether students are graduating from high school, everyone knows that. There's others that probably aren't aware of. You bring up a really good point, Marcus. Transparency is essential for building understanding and buy-in and things like that. Part of the reason we had this book as a pre-reading is because it's a fantastic example of all of the unintended negative consequences that inevitably result from trying to be data-driven with metrics like this. And the book, actually, I'd recommend reading the whole thing. The part you didn't read is a lot of case studies. It's like, what problems have we seen in higher ed, in K-12, in nonprofits, in business, in all these different realms. And all these different realms have the same issues. So we need to be transparent. We also need to be very careful about not putting too much emphasis on any one of these things, because the book talked about Campbell's Law. I mean, whatever people can game, they will. It's natural. So it's like we need to set up our whole system so that it supports everything that we value. Okay, so board end number 1, students are engaged and develop a strong academic foundation as measured by the following, overall and for historically underserved subgroups. So 1A, that is mastery of ELA and math foundational knowledge and skills by the end of first grade as measured by standardized assessments. And the idea there is really around early intervention. And there's a ton of research out there showing how predictive end of first grade reading and math skills are for later success. Right now we have Acadience, which used to be called DIBBLES, as a language arts assessment in place. We do not currently have we don't know if we have a math assessment in place for this. So we know they exist and we know there's ways to get them, but at this point we don't have one that we've decided on, so that's an area where we will need to do some research. 1B, ELA math and science proficiency in grades 3 through 8 as measured by the Oregon State Assessment. And that's basically a measure of the percentage of students meeting state standards. The ELA and math tests are given in grades 3 through 8 there. The science test is only given in grades 5 and 8 within those grade bands. You will astutely notice probably that high school is not included in this one. Part of the reason for that is high school participation is a massive issue both in our district and statewide. There's a lot of students who have come to the conclusion that isn't far-fetched that there's no benefit to them for taking this test or doing well on it. So that's a good reason to not use those data. And I think another one is we think we have better measures available for that. A lot of those are going to show up in board end number 2 as well. But once students get to high school, a lot of the shift focuses to the idea around credit attainment too. It's like our kids being successful in the rigorous types of classes we want them to take. 1C is kind of the other side of the coin with state testing, whereas 1B was around percentage of kids passing or meeting standards. 1C is around growth rates. So what the growth rates do is they really control for where students were when they started, and so students are always being compared to other students. They call them their academic peers. So other students who are performing just like them, what does their growth look like? The typical metric that the state uses for that are their median growth percentiles. We don't actually have those available this year because they require consecutive years of tests, and we have a lot of students who don't have, a 3rd grade and a 4th grade test, because last year, or was it 2 years ago? Not every student, last year I guess every student took every test. 2 years ago, only 3rd grade took ELA, 4th grade took math, 5th grade took science, but not everyone took every test. So, but we expect that to normalize. And that's a reason that 3rd grade's not included, because you don't have a baseline year. 3rd grade is the first year we collect those data. 1D, the percentage of 9th graders on track for graduation as measured by credit attainment. Right now, the way the state has it defined for a diploma, it's 24 credits, and the state's calculation is, so do students have at least 6 credits in any courses by the end of their 9th grade year? 1E is the percent of students designated as English learners that are on track to acquire English proficiency as measured by Oregon's English Language Proficiency Assessment. So I guess a nuance here is it's not a measure of students exiting, it's a measure of students being on track to exit the program. So those are student level data that the state provides us. And 1F, the final measure here, is the efficacy of academic programs as measured by surveys and or focus groups. And I think part of the reason this is important, if you look through all of these measures, there's really 3 of them that are heavily focused on ELA and math, and then we have another 3 that they capture that, but they're broader as well. And I think some of the benefit to having some qualitative data is it helps to broaden our scope, so we can get students' feedback on everything that they're experiencing. So social sciences and science and PE and all of these other things that we want them doing as well. So with that said, what questions do you have about any of those metrics?
And Dave, on 1F, clarification is some of the data that we're already receiving through youth truth surveys give us specific feedback on that as it exists currently. So we could continue to build upon that through that process, correct?
Yes, and ODE has a new survey that they have been piloting as well that may end up being worth using too once we were able to see what the data are actually reported out like. So yeah, I think there's a variety of options. We may be able to even add some questions to Youth Truth too if they don't have exactly what we need. If we need to customize 3 or 4 questions that really target something that we don't get through our other venues. Okay. So
I
then,
do have a question, Dave, sorry.
yeah.
My experience is that not only is the data kept for ninth graders on track to graduation, but there is a huge difference between getting 6 credits in ninth grade and what happens in 10th grade. My experience is that 10th grade is probably the toughest for most kids. I don't think we have any data comparisons on that, but I certainly would like to have us consider something about another stopgap at the end of sophomore year. If they aren't on track at the end of the sophomore year, there isn't much chance of making up credits. At the end of freshman, there's lots of credit. There's lots of options. Both in district and out of district, online, all kinds of things. But that sophomore year is really to me, the final chance that we have to get kids online.
Yeah, I know the Oregon Department of Ed has done a lot of their own studies, and what they have found is that if students are on track at the end of their ninth grade year, they're like overwhelmingly likely to graduate by the end of high school. So, I mean, one thing we could look at is like how many students do we have who are on track at the end of ninth grade, and how many of those students actually fall off by the end of 10th grade.
And,
certainly something to invest.
Shirley, I think that that's a great example of what Steve said earlier about there are lots of other data that we track and we can certainly report on. So, at our high school level, regular periods through the year, that we have teams, the grad coach, the counselors, the administrators that look at attendance, they look at student behavior, and they look at grades, and who are the kids rising to the top. So we have regular monitoring systems in place for that. But again, there are more things that we could report on. Dave picked ninth grade because, as he said, there's a very, very strong correlation there. Though having taught 10th graders, I understand your point.
Okay, so then if you would flip to the second page of the workshop activity. So for end number 1, there are, it looks like, 5 possible inferences, assumptions, and conclusions that pertain to this idea around schools building a strong academic foundation. So I'll let you read through those. I don't think I need to read those. Okay, so I think what the slight adjustment is going to be with the odd numbers and the remote folks and all that, just rather than partnering up to do independent work time. So why don't we leave about, I guess we can target 10 minutes as a start to this. And really the idea, there's 3 key questions on here. And so it's comparing the metrics, basically the idea of, do these metrics support the ends? And then answering these key questions, reflecting on the inferences, assumptions, and conclusions and judgments that they provide. And then once you are done with that, we can have a discussion about where we're at. So I will start a timer.
Hey, Dave, before you start the timer, I have one clarifying question that you and I had talked about earlier, which is if you look at those inferences, assumptions, and conclusions, those 5 bullets at the top, those assumptions aren't necessarily negative or positive. Those are our assumptions. And can you just speak to the importance of letting that be in its own space, if you will, whatever those assumptions are? I mean, I think that's, you had a really great comment the other day when we were talking that I think is, I hope you remember it.
Yeah, it's not ringing a bell. But yeah, basically what we did, a few of us looked through these and we just, looking at what the metrics are, it's like, what are the most logical, predictable, reasonable conclusions, inferences, assumptions that people are going to make about what we're trying to do based on the metrics that we're using there. So yeah, some inferences sometimes have and assumptions have negative connotations. That is not this at all. Again, the idea around using data well is it's around the appropriateness of the inferences and assumptions and judgments that we make. So the question really, it's not, do we have these? We all have them. It's, are they as appropriate and useful as they need to be? Your data are only as good as your assumptions and your inferences.
And Dave, we're looking at in board in gold number 1, correct? Or we're looking at number 2 right now?
Just number 1.
That's what I thought.
Yep.
Dave, I think I have an assumption that maybe I'd like somebody else to react to. Just as we were talking earlier, and
Shirley, I think what Dave wants us to do is to do our independent think time first and
Okay,
jot
and then
those down, and then we're
okay.
going to do a group conversation. Yeah, and I apologize to Dave and everybody, but any attendance person at any school right now can tell you that there is a massive bug going around, and so he didn't expect. I'm sorry, he didn't expect to have 2 people with sickness in their households doing this remotely. So I know it makes it harder.
Just about 2 more minutes. Okay, and with that, I guess let's open it up to what thoughts, comments, questions, ideas do folks have?
Yes, I do recognize that a lot of the high school information is tied to N2, but I still think that if we are banking on our public understanding what we're doing and whether or not we're being successful, it seems to me that a strong academic foundation should include some level of high school. And this may be one of those things that we're tracking in different ways, and I'm just not aware of it. But
So-
that would be a thought.
Yeah, one comment I would make is that's an area where we might get through end 2 first, because a lot of end 2 captures what happens in high school, so.
Yes, and I would say that especially as Dave explains 2B and the work that is being done both within Ben Lapine, and we're really looking at models nationally on this, I think that'll be addressed, and then we can come back.
I have a question. When we talk about targets and benchmarks, is this the conversation that we're talking about it? I know we were sent the article about the metrics and the warning about this exact thing. But I remember I keep asking this question and I keep being told we're going to have that conversation. And is this the conversation or not?
On what the targets would be?
Yeah, so like we talk about outcomes and experiences. And so it's, as measured by standardized assessments, but that's what we're measuring, but are we trying to raise a bar to a certain level? Do we have a target for specific populations or just everybody in general? When we talk about percent of ninth graders on track for graduation, sure, track it all you like, but are we trying to set targets or are we not? I feel like I keep being told that we're going to think about that later. And it's been 3 years now that I keep wondering if that's just, we don't want to, or then I want an answer as to why not.
Yeah. I think that comes back to the level piece that Dave mentioned and setting those levels. And so what we would like to walk away tonight with is agreement on the metrics that we're going to be using, the next step, because as a board, our goal is, or our purview is to oversee the superintendent's work on those, and we will have agreed upon metrics, and then it's the superintendent's will be coming with his strategic initiatives, but we will need to gather the baseline data, and a lot of this baseline data, this is our first year back. So it's a yes and, we're hoping to land on these, have our baseline, and then quite honestly, it's a big conversation on how you set those targets and whether we're setting those targets by, just straight growth, are we setting them tethered to the state average, or what our aspiration is in each of those areas is going to be a whole second conversation.
No, absolutely. I think identifying what those metrics are, that's very first step. And then that next conversation about what exactly are the benchmarks that we're using, what are the targets that we're setting is a whole very lengthy set of work. But that is linked to that, is what I'm hearing you saying.
Yes.
So can you guys hear me?
We can, Amy.
Sorry. And I apologize if I ask a question that doesn't not make sense. I really don't feel awesome right now. But question, because on 1A, we mentioned mastery of ELA and math, but it sounds like we're not actually assessing math. Sorry, my son just walked in. Dean, I need a few minutes, honey. It sounds like we're not actually assessing math. So if we could just speak to, do other districts our size assess math with a standardized tool? Why aren't we? And if we're not doing it, do we need to change that since we're only doing in ELA, the Dibbles tool, nothing for math?
Yeah, so I can speak to that. We most certainly are assessing math. I mean, in first grade, the question is more, what types of tools are we using to assess math? And for a board end metric like this, what we really need to do is make sure we have a high quality standardized measure that is consistent across all of our schools, and ideally something that we can tie to national norms, I guess would be the way to say it. So, I mean, I know we actually have some really high quality assessments that we're using as part of our math curriculum. The Forefront tool is really powerful. There's great ways that teachers can look at their data. What I don't know the answer to is whether that right now is an adequate tool for, a systems improvement type of question, or whether we need to look at an external independent type of measure. So, I mean, that's just an area that we need to do more legwork in.
Yeah, and so from a board perspective, if we adopt this metric for this goal, we are saying as a board that we want math measured with a standardized assessment, or in a standardized way, using a common assessment across all of our first grade classrooms.
And if I could add, Amy, I think an important clarification is that we're talking about systemic measure versus individual student performance, and teachers are doing those tests in classrooms every single day to ensure that students are meeting expectations at respective grade levels. I think the question is, what would we decide as or recommend to the board is the most effective measure of systemic improvement across whatever tool we're going to be using.
I have a question about 1B and 1C. If we didn't use those two assessments, what are the other options?
How much time and money do we have? And so that's the tool that the state has put in place, and a good reason to use that is it is a nationally norm reference test. It's basically built on the Smarter Balanced platform, which was one of the two big, high-quality assessments that were made, 10 or 15 years ago now. They're designed from the ground up for systems accountability. One of the things that I think has been unfortunate in the way that Oregon has done a lot of what it's done around assessment is, even though these tests are designed for systems accountability, they've tied a lot of it to students, things around essential skills. And it's like looking at how individual students are doing about this, individual students that. That's never really been the purpose of these. The purpose of these assessments are overall, how are we doing as a state? How are we doing as a district? And how are we doing as a school? How are we doing with all of our different student demographic groups? I mean, the test is really designed to do exactly what it's doing here. So I wouldn't, it would take a lot for me to have a compelling reason to jettison that and go off in a different direction, I think.
And thank you for that. When you talk about, I think you mentioned, did you mention, maybe I heard something that you didn't say about the opt-out that happens? Does that affect how reliable this data is? Do you worry about that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That's a reason that we've excluded high school here. In general, I would say at the elementary school, our participation rates are in the low to mid 90%. At the middle school, it's in the mid to high 80 or even low 90%. Generally, there's a technical advisory committee that doing work with the state, and their benchmark is pretty much if you're getting to around 80%, you can be confident in your results. So based on our historical patterns, we have full confidence that our middle and elementary data are reliable, valid, it's usable. High school, our participation rates are 50% is probably a good ballpark for where it's at, and it's low across the state. And so that's a reason to exclude high school from this, because if we included it in a K-12 measure, it would make our results less valid to interpret, because we wouldn't know what they actually mean.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really important piece for people to understand of why we're excluding 11th grade. I wrote down on one of my assumptions or inferences that people could negatively assume that we're part of lowering the bar on graduation requirements if we're not looking at 11th grade. And that could not be further from the truth on why we wouldn't look at our 11th grade state assessment scores.
See, the assumption I have in terms of the data when you said the middle schoolers start getting to 80% and it's 90% at elementary school, in terms of attendance, other behavioral things, like I said, what are we doing to maybe try to circumvent, not just to say be included in the assessment, but being able to have another measure in the sense, okay, why are they at where they're at or why they're lagging? What can we help utilize some of those things to be able to get them to not just to do the test, but get a baseline to feel for where they're at and feel comfortable doing it. So.
In terms of looking at these, I think I noted a few assumptions or conclusions that I would hope the public would draw from these goals as a whole with each of them. I think the first is that there is a pathway and that we really look at our system as a K-12 system with points to gather evidence of student learning as building blocks along the continuum. Second, I would say that our data shows and our data points, especially when we're looking at that 1st and 9th grade piece, is that we're not just focused on we are focused on academic excellence, and we have a slant towards early intervention. So we've put in key places to gather data, and we are committed to use that data as a system for intervention. And then last, which I think is extremely important, is that our goal is not just equity in the district, because equity is not necessarily a benefit if it's equally poor learning. And I'm not saying that is happening in our schools, but that we want to have equitable academic achievement across our schools. And so I think that those are strong assumptions and conclusions, and I believe that those are ones that people could draw from this. A last piece that's a little softer and nuanced, but I think by including stakeholder data as one of the pieces, an assumption that we're making is that our kids can provide us with valuable feedback about our system and how it's promoting academic achievement, and that our families can as well. And so I appreciate that layer in terms of our stakeholders and valuing their input.
Dave, one of the key questions that struck a chord with me was, do the proposed metrics provide clear, high-quality evidence for schools' efficacy in supporting the board ends? And one of my concerns on how we report this data comes around the lines of the mobility of students in some of our schools. And that's a measure that is not distributed equitably and discriminately hits some of our schools that have like a higher rate of apartments in their zones. And so part of what I would want us to consider as we measure this data is keeping an eye on the mobility rates of each of the schools, and perhaps looking at the idea of cohort tracking as it relates to systems performance, not as a measure for student performance, but as it relates to the system. If we're talking about the performance of a school and the impact of the folks in the school on student learning and engagement, and how that applies to achievement, then I would posit that we want to hold for the factors that are in the school's control, which student mobility in and out of the school is not. It's not fair to hold them accountable for. If 25% of their students are brand new to them, those test scores are brand new to them as well. And so the impact of those staff and those student, or the student learning would be seen as a different light than a school in which 3% mobility might be the factor for that year.
Yep. So that's an important and a messy conversation. I know there's a couple of ways to approach that. One is the cohort tracking, which you mentioned, just like you grab a cohort of kids, and of the kids who stick around, you track them over time. Another approach, what the state does with the accountability data, is they've got a flag essentially called full academic year. If a student was enrolled in a school for half the year plus 1 day, it trips the full academic year flag. So those are the students who are counted as towards their achievement data for the year. So a couple of things that we can talk about there.
Amy or Shamiko, are there any other questions or comments you'd like to make on board end 1 before we move to end 2?
Just one more question. When we talk about tracking these for the overall student population and for historically underserved subgroups, can we, maybe this isn't the right conversation, so sorry, I keep jumping around. Can we spell that out as to what subgroups we're talking about? Not to me right now, I mean, in this particular document.
Yes, and I think I'll ask Dave to speak to this a little bit too. But I think one of the big pieces that I want to point out in the historically underserved that I really appreciate Ben Lapine does and Dave has been doing is we are not looking at our historically underserved subgroup against the average. We're looking at the historically underserved against the not historically underserved, so that we're looking at unduplicated numbers, which I think is a hugely important thing to do. Dave, do you want to talk in terms of the other piece of why to look at that group and what you're thinking?
Yeah, so that's probably even a messier conversation than the one Steve brought up. I get maybe the way I'd enter this, I guess, is as someone who deals a lot with data, when people come to me or people I work with data requests, they always seem simple to them, but then once we start peeling back the layers of the onion, it's like, what do you actually mean when you're asking for these data? And it's a lot of work to actually really clearly, coherently, operationally define exactly what we're talking about. Just one example here. If we're talking about English language learners, who are the students that are in that group? For ELL, we have students who are currently served. We have students who were served but were exited. We have students who are eligible for services but refused. We have a group called Ever ELL, which is any student who has ever received ELL services. And there's probably one or two more that I'm forgetting. So when we say we want data on our ELL students, which of those groups are we talking about? And another question is, are all of those groups actually historically underserved? If you look statewide at the data, kids who actually went through ELL and exited have a higher graduation rate than the general white population. So, I mean, do we want them in our historically underserved conversation? We can have the same conversation with special education and all sorts of other groups as well. And then there's another thing to consider is just the size of the group. If you try to get too specific, if we, like with race and ethnicity, if we looked at every race and ethnicity, we get a lot of groups that are really small. And so if you're not really paying attention to the data, if there's 10 students in the group, the difference between 6 kids passing and 8 kids passing, that's 20%, but it's a couple of kids. So it's hard to know exactly what that means. So there's a lot to unpack, I guess, in this notion of thinking clearly about which subgroups and we track, how we do it, and what makes the most sense in terms of answering this question about systems improvement.
Thank you for explaining the complexity of that. That sounds really, really hard. Will we be identifying exactly what we mean, knowing like all the difficulties you just presented, and obviously there's many more that you're not telling me. Will we be identifying those before we finalize this document or no?
I believe we have identified who falls into the historically underserved currently because it's also a state definition. Is that correct, Dave?
Yes, for the most part. Again, the caveat here is last year with basically every student in the district was considered economically disadvantaged because every student was served free and reduced lunch. So what that did in effect is it blew up our historically underserved group. So as we're moving forward, it should get better, but then there's nuances even within that group. Which students are we talking? Are we talking about migrant? Are we talking about foster kids? Are we talking about, I mean, there's a lot of different groups within that as well that I think we want to consider, whether we track it as a whole or whether we track those individually within that group, so.
And I think what we look at, I think there's this other piece where data is gathered, data is looked at. We're seeing those differentiations, and at a systems level, we're working to close those between the historically underserved and the not historically underserved. And those subgroups are getting, those individual subgroups, the right data is being tracked by our leadership. And then if there are pieces where, for example, we are seeing, like we did in our survey data, that it is very clear that our students who are LGBTQ plus are having different results or different experiences in our schools than we would expect as a board, that our superintendent comes and has a strategic initiative that includes how he is addressing the experience for that group. Likewise, if we were seeing, our team says, you know what, we're really seeing a difference between our students with lower SES versus our students with higher SES on that 9th grade credit, then how is he deploying our high school success coaches, for example, with that student population. So I think that differentiation between each of those groups is on the superintendent to be looking at the actions specific to those groups. That's my take, but Steve, let me know if I'm how you feel about that.
That was spot on, and I think part of what we're aspiring to do is to have the system start the process of giving itself feedback on performance as a system, so that the system decisions are the ones that we're tending to rather than anecdotes. That's under the right conditions, data can tell us how we make those moves. And so Shamiko's point of, do we need benchmarks? Do we need, all of that is yes. The answer is yes for all of that. And as the system starts to get established, the next steps will be, what are the points of evidence that are going to tell us we're being effective, and what are the points of evidence that are telling us places where we're not? And then we would, in turn, develop plans to attack that, so that those deficiencies, if you will, can be addressed specifically.
And I would say even in that gap closing, again, coming back to the actions, I oftentimes speak to, or the examples I often use in terms of the gaps are related to our students who have identified special needs, as well as our African American students who we may not have a number that gives us valid and reliable data at the grade level, but if we look at the full system, we have enough to start looking at that. And so then again, if we are focused on continuous improvement, we want the historically underserved group as a whole to be improving, but if we're seeing that one classification is improving and another isn't improving as fast, then again, we expect our superintendent to be coming with strategic initiatives tailored to the students who are not making the progress, not making the same level of progress as their peers.
Thank you. That answered my question perfectly.
Okay, I think we're ready to move on to end 2. So back to, again, the draft board ends and metrics. Number 2 is students have a passion, purpose, and plan for their future as measured by the following for overall and for historically underserved subgroups. So 2A, it would be tracking 4-year and 5-year graduation rates and the 5-year completer rate. And I think part of the way to think about that is again, this measure is looking at how prepared are students basically towards the end of their high school career. We see that as the minimum level of success. Like every student leaving our system, we want them to have a diploma. That's the minimum bar for what most students will need to be successful when they leave. 2B.
Dave, can you clarify for us the difference between 5-year graduation and 5-year completer so everyone's on the same page?
Yeah, and let me give one more caveat too. I know the state is just embarking on this process of completely potentially redesigning what the diploma looks like, so these may go away, but a 5-year graduator is someone who took 5 years instead of 4 to meet the full requirements of the Oregon diploma, so the 24 credits, or in Ben Lapine it could be 26 credits. Whereas a completer is someone who went through the system for 5 years, but they did not earn a diploma. But an example could be a student who was receiving special education services and does like a transition into employment afterwards. So they'd be meeting a different level of requirement, I guess, to leave the system than what a graduate would have. But in terms of percentage of students, 5-year completer is a very, very, very small number of students. I guess one other thing there, I believe right now GEDs do go into the completer rate, but not into the graduate, which there's parts of that that really makes no sense, because if you've seen how hard it is to pass the GED now, but I think that's an ODE or a federal requirement that's above what we have any say in. But so 2B, The way we've been referring to that is really, it's a diploma plus. So it's the idea that the student has earned their diploma and they've accomplished at least one of these other career and life indicators. As I think Steve was saying, Melissa was saying, we've been looking at what some other groups, other states have been doing, other districts have been doing with this, and there's some pretty, I think, impressive thinking going into this. So we've piggybacked on some of that. Really what we've tried to do is identify what are the data that we're collecting in our system that are high quality, that we think is high quality evidence of students going above and beyond just a high school diploma. And so there are, I think, 7 of these. The first one is if students earn 2 or more credits of advanced placement or international baccalaureate. And thinking about 1 credit equaling 1 semester, this would mean basically a full year of AP or a full year of IB. So if a student has a diploma, plus they completed a full year of AP or IB. A second one would be 2...
I'm sorry, can I ask another clarifying question there?
Yes.
1 credit is the full year, though, isn't it 0.5 and 0.5 per semester? I'm just trying to, so is this 2 classes for a full year?
Yeah, 2 classes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, sorry.
2 is 2 semester or 3/4 hours of college credit eligible coursework. And that doesn't necessarily mean a student had to earn college credits for that, but it means that they successfully completed coursework that's at a level of rigor that's difficult enough where they could earn college credit for it. Because I know at like Mountain View High School, we have students who are taking courses at that level, but then they aren't actually necessarily receiving college credit for those courses. 3 is the state seal of biliteracy. That would be available for students who basically demonstrate fluency in 2 languages by the end of graduation. And there's I wouldn't call it there's an assessment process that students need to demonstrate their proficiency in 2 languages to be able to earn that. Number 4 is 2 years of junior ROTC. The benefit to that is if students complete 2 years of junior ROTC, they get to enter the military at a higher rank than they would have been able to had they not done that. 5 would be diploma plus they are CTE, Career and Technical Education Concentrator. A concentrator is a student who earns 2 or more credits within a specific program. So it's not just that they've taken, a credit of foods and a credit of mechanics or something, but it's a coherent sequence within one program of CTE. The next one is Diploma Plus. They have met the college readiness benchmarks or the state benchmarks in both language arts and mathematics, and they've demonstrated that either on the Smarter Balance test, the ACT, or the SAT assessment. And I think mixing and matching there would be completely appropriate if a student passed the math benchmark on the SAT and the English benchmark on the ACT. They've demonstrated proficiency in both. And the final one is if students meet the full admission requirements for all Oregon Public Universities, which I think mostly breaks down to, do they have the GPA that is at the high enough level where they would be accepted into every public university in the state? And have they completed all of the coursework requirements that every university would require? There's 2 different levels of that, so we would set the benchmark at what's the highest level that would be required. Because I think OSU, U of O, and there might be one other that has a higher GPA requirement than what some other schools would have. So we would just set that at the high point there. 2C is more measures based on surveys and or focus groups about what students have to tell us about their preparedness for their future. And then 2D, we crossed that out. That was on here as a proposal. As a district, we would advocate that we didn't include a measure of the percent of students who enroll in a 2 or 4 year university as measured by National Student Clearinghouse data. Again, those are data we have, those are data we are going to continue to collect, but our focus has really been on trying to measure what are the impacts that we can control while kids are with us in the K-12 system. And that's a pretty good segue to the activity that you're going to look at. We've actually, the first page looks the same. You just have a few of the inferences and the same key questions to reflect on. We've also included data and inferences for why we would advocate that we do not include the 2 and 4 year measure. So I can just quickly talk you through this chart. We're looking at the class of 2014, but we have these for a variety of different graduating classes, and all the graphs look the same. One of the things that we see pretty consistently, if you look at the magenta at the bottom, those are the students who actually earned a post-secondary degree within 6 to 8 years of graduating high school. So what we see is basically going to college isn't enough, because 35 to 40% of students of our graduates end up earning a degree from a post-secondary institution 6 to 8 years after they've graduated high school. Another thing of interest we see in here is if you look at all the bars except for the purple on the top, essentially what that's telling us is of the students who choose to go to college, roughly, like right around half of those students will fail to earn a college degree within 6 to 8 years. So about half do, about half don't. So getting to college isn't enough. We know it's more about, are we making sure that kids are doing the right planning while they're in our system, and the kids who are going to college are the students who are going to earn a diploma once they go to college and not leave after 3 or 4 years, 2 years saddled with massive amounts of debt and no degree to show for it, because there's an abundance of research showing that the value of a college education is the degree that you get at the end. It's not the learning that happens along the way, but you have to leave with that piece of paper. So, and then we've included some of the inferences that we think are problematic in using that as a measure for this end as well. So was 10 minutes a good amount of time? Okay, we'll set the timer for the same. All right, I'm seeing 2 minutes left. Do we need that time, or should we reconvene?
I feel like at the dais, we're ready. I don't know, Shamiko and Amy, do you need an additional 2 minutes, or are you ready?
I'm ready.
I'm ready.
Great.
All right, let's open it up for critical thinking.
Well, you know,
comments.
Vice Chair LeGrand does quite a bit of work in this area, so I'm going to have him start us off.
All right, get ready for the barrage of questions. The first one is 2B subset, the credits for the advanced placement. In terms of that subgroups, we know that's very low when it comes to underserved areas. That's one question for me. How can we actually, increase that? Other things I'm looking at as well is some other assumptions that popped in my head too, is that our CTE piece is that why we have a propensity to always push our C and D students toward those things versus our AB students. Because people think that because they're getting C's and D's, that they basically are going to be minimized to low wage jobs. The other assumption too is, what if I don't want to go to college? What if I want to do something else? Where's that assumption? That's one assumption. A critical piece, like for instance, if my daughter wants to be in theater, arts, design, why can't I have that offered at my school? So, course choice. Additionally, instructors, do they have the flexibility to be able to do the instruction and get the professional development they need in terms of doing some of these things? Because we flip the classroom a lot at the college level in terms of trying to give them practical ways to be able to do this. Relationship building is key. It's a poor assumption too. If we had better relationships in terms of, working with our students, and that comes from having the counselors work on curriculum more than actually just doing scheduling.
Yep.
Okay. Do what they're supposed to be doing as counselors. That's why we have master's degrees in it, but that's just me making another assumption. Build better rapport to understand exactly what these students want and what their vision is. Because personally, like for me, I'm an AB student, but I did not want to go to college right away. So what am I going to get in terms of skill set to be able to allow me to be able to continue to do what I want to do? So there's just some of my assumptions, just looking at this and looking at some of those underserved areas when it comes to IB and looking at other pathways other than college. Because we know what some of the debt looks like with college. And I know some of the assumptions we have too when they get to us at the college level. Many of them do not realize that they have to live too, versus just doing the academic portion. I think we forget that is a part of this as well. So, yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah, so I think my comment to that would be, what we've tried to do in here is build a broad array of options that students have. So whether it's CTE, whether it's college prep coursework, whether it's ROTC, there's several different things that we're tracking that show that kids are going, again, above and beyond just a high school diploma. Not that I'm trying to denigrate a high school diploma, but a lot of students need, for what their goals are, they need something beyond just a high school diploma. So trying to make as many pathways as possible for that. And I would also acknowledge, there are things that I think we would like to be able to track that are important right now that, frankly, we don't have the capacity to be able to do. Like one example might be internships. Like how do we guarantee the quality of the internships that students are in? How do we track what success looks like in those internships, things like that? That's an area that's ripe for development, but I don't think we could in good conscience put that on here and think that we could measure it in a reliable and valid, usable way.
And I would like to add to that, if you just look at the math of these 7 criteria under 2B, 4 of the 7 speak specifically to what you would consider a student going on and beyond into college or meeting the expectations of being college prepared. And 3 of them have zero affiliation with being college bound, have no affiliation with being college bound, and could be accessed by students who have no intention of going to college and are seeking a different pathway. And so adding value to both sides of that conversation, I think, creates energy towards giving students who have typically not had some form of recognition, giving them the opportunity to have that recognition and while still choosing the path that seems to fit their plan more effectively.
I have a question about the plan you just mentioned. I think it's assumed that they might have a plan if they're taking IB classes or they're gaining admission to universities, but that's not always the case. Is there a way to measure or track, maybe that's not even something that we do yet, whether a student is making a plan for post-graduation?
Shamiko, we had on one of the earlier drafts, we were playing around with a measure that would be tied to our future centers at our high schools, and how many of the students actually developed, accessed and developed. And as we were as Cabinet was tossing that one around, I think one of the questions, and then when I met with Dave, I think one of the pieces, and with Deputy Superintendent Nordquist, is whether that becomes just it's the quality piece, just like Dave was mentioning around the internships, of do we have the systems in place to be able to not only track whether kids have developed that plan, but the quality, and if we had that as a assessment measure here, would it really be just whether kids, are we just collecting whether kids develop, did their plan regardless of the quality? And felt like it was really not necessarily a test of how it would end up being. It had the risk of ending up as a measure of whether kids completed a task rather than were prepared and had an idea of what their future might be, and therefore felt like these would be a higher accountability measure for our schools and our district, our system. If we were saying, no, we don't want to know whether they have a plan, we want to know that they've executed in their high school years towards that plan, whether it's junior ROTC, it's our CTE pathways, et cetera.
And Shamiko, I would add on 2C that students will be getting an opportunity to provide feedback on their perception, their self-perception of their preparedness annually through the Youth Truth data or the questions that we would be asking of them. And so we would be getting real-time feedback from them as it relates to their progress towards what that plan would be. And so we could very easily identify weaknesses in their processing through their high school years, whether or not they're availing themselves of those opportunities, and whether or not that needs to be elevated. So we're putting this more in the forefront of their decision making and giving them broader access. And so this is, as it relates to the article that Dave shared, it isn't just the hard data that we want, but it's also, as students are going through and matriculating through our system, what they're telling us about their experience as they go, so that we can adjust the system to ensure that if we have 100 students that are in a particular cohort, that 100 of them knew and understood that they could avail themselves of those future centers and help get support as they started working through that planning.
But do you think that could come in better clarity with their forecast? Because I think that's a lot of it too. Like if I'm a ninth grader and I'm eighth grader getting ready to come to the ninth grade, and I'm forecasting what I want to do, and I have no idea, but then also I'm behind in math and science, how can I actually have a good measure of understanding where I'm going to need to be by my 10th and my 11th grade year to make those proper decisions?
And I'm going to take that comment and take it right back to what Shamiko asked earlier, which is, how do we get started with this? And the process of establishing these matter to us as an entire system immediately elevates that for every single kid and all of a sudden, and for every staff member for that matter. And so it becomes something that schools, if you talk about high quality evidence for schools' efficacy, The second that the board says, yep, these are our value statements and these are the initiatives that we believe are going to drive the work towards the ends that we desire for our kids, that immediately becomes more attenuated.
I have a question, Dave, on AP and IB. Does that mean they've just completed the courses, or they've actually passed the test to get the credit?
So it's passing the course, it's not necessarily taking the test. Again, Mountain View again, I believe we have several students who will take an AP course and they don't need to take the test because then even passing the class, I think, links to a program at COCC. So it's like the students have no incentive to do it, and you've got an equity issue with AP and IB tests where someone has to pay for that as well, so.
One other comment. The professional graduation trackers that help put reunions together do a really good job of, this is a little off the subject, but they do a real good job of tracking kids. If we're interested in whether or not the kids actually completed what they said they wanted to complete, there might be an opportunity at some point, and it's going to be pretty soft data, but it might be an opportunity to give us some feedback.
I think my question really for the board at this point, first, I feel like, an assumption that I would hope people see from this goal is that we are very committed to high school graduation, and we are committed to ensuring that our students begin that path process in our high schools so that they don't leave our high schools with a diploma and have no idea what's next. And so I appreciate that about this. I also appreciate the differentiation of looking at 4-year and 5-year. Traditionally, our 5-year is higher, and there are a variety of reasons why kids may require 5 years, and I think that's really important data, and that we're really excluding that group of students when we don't look at 5-year graduation as well. And then, so for the question I would have for our group, for our board, is are we comfortable with the recommendation from the district of not using the 2- and 4-year National Student Clearinghouse data? And I will say I'm comfortable with it. Amy and Shamiko?
Yep, also comfortable.
Yeah, same.
Okay, great. So then we will move forward to end 3.
All right, and they seem to get shorter as we go. So end 3 is, again, around school culture, school climate. Do student, staff, and families experience wellness, inclusion, and belonging in our schools as measured by, again, and overall and for historically underserved subgroups whenever possible. 3A, the idea is we've started doing this, but we want to track bias incidents and trends in bias incidents in our schools. This is something I think that we're new to institutionalizing in a thoughtful, standardized way. So there's a lot of progress we need to make on this yet. I think this is one of those situations where we're probably, when you think about targets and goals and all that, this is where you might see one of those J curves where it's like, well, once we are actually collecting all the data with fidelity, we're probably going to see a big dip in our data before things get better. So that's just something to be aware of. And the second measure here, again, is student, family, and staff experiences of key elements around school culture. So voice, belonging, emotional, psychological wellness, as measured through various surveys, focus groups, whatever means we have to engage them in those ways. I think there's something to be said for the fact that this really is in a lot of ways, it's a measure of perception. I mean, when you look at academic excellence, there's a lot of more concrete, it's like, do kids have these skills? This is more about, well, what's my experience in schools? So I think it makes a lot of sense to have this be heavily weighted on 3B. It's like, if it's about your perceptions, what then tell us about your perceptions, and we can go really deep, I think, into that and get people's feedback on that. Then for 3C and 3D, this is similar to the 2 and 4 year college. Those were on there, and those are two measures that as a district we would actually recommend not including. Again, thinking back to the purpose of this whole discussion, it's the idea of are these metrics a high quality measure of whether we're achieving this end? And a lot of the data, a lot of the inferences and assumptions around chronic absenteeism and suspensions, it's questionable how tight the linkage is between these measures and what the climate and culture of the school looks like. So when you get into the second page of End 3, we've provided some, again, potentially problematic inferences, assumptions, and conclusions that pertain to student attendance and chronic absenteeism. And we've actually included just a few paragraphs there was a new study that came out in April from the Fordham Institute looking at some of the problems with how schools measure attendance. So we've just highlighted some of the key findings and takeaways from that for you to look at. And then the next page, I've actually included, I think this is about 10 years worth of chronic absenteeism or attendance data for our district. The top graph here, it shows the blue are students, the percent of students who are chronically absent. The gray are students who are not chronically absent. And you can see this pretty clear trend where in elementary, kindergartens tends to be the lowest, then attendance increases to about 3rd or 4th grade. And then from there, you see a steady decline. This is the exact same trend that we see this in our district. This is the same trend that the state sees. This is the same trend that we see nationally. So this, I think, relates to some of the problematic inferences of is attendance actually measuring the same thing that it is in high school, that it is in elementary school. Just for fun, a week or two ago, I went and looked at the chronic absenteeism among 12th graders. 12 students who are chronically absent in their 12th grade year have a higher graduation rate than kids who are not chronically absent in their 12th grade year, which, if you follow the logic, that could make some sense. But a lot of this just leads to a discussion around this idea that attendance is really, it's a means to an end, but it's not an end. So if we're going to use this, we want to make sure that it's an accurate portrayal of what we're trying to measure in terms of how it pertains to school climate and culture. And then I'd say the same idea applies to the data around student suspensions, and whether or not we're suspending students from school is a good measure of the climate and the culture of a school building. So.
And I just want to add, again, there are all kinds of things that we measure and track all the time that may not be appropriate to include as measures of these ends. So we would be the first to say that we believe attendance is very, very important, and it definitely impacts student learning. So that's not the argument we're making here.
All right, I will set the timer. about a minute and a half left.
Amy and Shamiko, how are you guys doing? Do you need more time?
Great. Nope. Nope, I'm good.
All right, let's proceed.
Awesome. All right. So I think there's a couple of pieces in this that I'd love to share on. I think that really, based on our excellence and equity review process, this was the area that really the data showed we need to work on as a district. And it's why this board has been pushing this, and really trying to support this work for our district. And so we're trying to figure out how to have the best and the right data. And I think that you are right. I think I really appreciate that the survey data is probably going to be the right place. And so a wondering is, do we actually split out 3B? And two ways that I was thinking about it. One way to split it out would be just like we did with the Oregon State assessments, and having a goal that is just on the raw data, and then a second goal that is focused not on growth, but actually on the opposite, and that would be about closing the gaps and either looking at growth for those subgroups or the rate to which we're closing the gap, because that's what we're seeing is a gap in experience for some of our subgroups. Not all. I believe our English language learner subgroup actually was higher than our average in some of the indicators. So I'll say that would be one way. Another way I've seen in some districts that I work with is that they've actually set out specific indicators that they're looking at and named it. So rather than having it in parentheses, actually having, a goal on voice, a goal on belonging, and a goal on emotional, psychological wellness. So that's the first piece, and that would just feel more in line with what we did with academic achievement, of actually having a specific goal for the growth piece and for the performance. And again, that's a whole nother question on Youth Truth of, are we going, how we're going to tether what our goal is. But I do think I can say on behalf of the board that we would like to see that gap decreased. And so if that's an appropriate goal to make.
So
yeah.
maybe I'm not understanding, but
Yeah.
I mean, my belief would be that for every single measure, we are looking at historically underserved.
Mm-hmm.
Not so even on these surveys, whenever we are able to disaggregate data for groups, that we'll be doing that by default. Is
Yeah.
what you're saying different than that?
A little bit, because I think that when we're thinking about the board and thinking about our governance model, what we do each year is we set goals with the superintendent and metrics, and we will be setting benchmarks after we have our baseline. And so what I'm thinking is that we would want to have a benchmark. We would want to have a data point that is about our raw benchmarks, and we would want to have a data point about closing the gap as well. Just like we're going to have a data point in math and ELA that is raw proficiency, and one that is about the growth of the cohort.
Melissa, I'd like to respond in thinking about separating those three. One of the things, so I'm thinking about the two ways that we'll collect that perception data are through surveys, and we have the existing Youth Truth survey that we do annually, and then focus groups. So we had our excellence and equity review this fall. We'll be I'm looking at Kinsey, probably 12 to 15 different groups that we're going to be having community conversations with. And that's a requirement for the integrated planning process, that every 2 years you have an iteration of those community conversations and listening sessions. The thing, when I think about how those are structured and when I think about the statements on the Youth Truth Survey, I think we may have some difficulty separating these into three. You know, the questions aren't exactly like, what is your psychological wellness? Would you feel like you have a voice? You know, they get to these themes, but I'm a little concerned about, you know, when I think about the listening, the community conversations, those are usually a few questions that we hear from people, and then we pull the themes that come out of it. You know, they're not that categorized, I guess. So that would be my concern about separating those.
I can totally hear that, and I would be fine keeping them together, but I do think that I think it would make sense to give the surveys a little bit more weight by having the two different indicators on the surveys. Yeah. And then the other piece, for Shamiko and Amy, and Shirley, and I have just explained to Marcus, Dave and I have gone around and around on attendance and suspension. And so here's where I've landed on this question. And thank you for the reading as well. I fully recognize that attendance data is problematic as it moves from elementary to middle and high, because the kid who gets braces and misses one class gets marked oftentimes absent the same way a kid that's not in school all day. And so it's very natural to see much higher percentages at different grade levels. And I heard Laura speaking earlier around attendance, and us, you know, knowing that that is a goal, but also that it's not necessarily a direct correlation. So I think that I would be okay removing attendance, the chronic absence. But again, if we're seeing correlations, and I think that attendance work has a pretty large body of evidence on this, that when we're looking at those first grade reading and math rates, the impact of chronic absence in kindergarten and first grade is absolutely detrimental to the reading and math proficiency of little kids. And so, again, I would just be asking that we're looking at that piece of the puzzle when we're looking at those literacy and math scores. So I'd be fine with attendance coming off, because it's not a correlated piece, but I would expect to see it in the actions. The one that I'm having a really hard time with, because I do believe that this is something that the board wants to look at, and it may not be in engagement, and it may not be a perfect correlation to engagement, but when we look at our suspension data, and we have our historically underserved population receiving 75% of the suspensions when they're only 40% of the student population, that's a problem. And so it may not be the right one for engagement, but it is something we need to be looking at and the board would like to monitor. And so I am open to suggestions of where that lives, but I feel like we do need to have the suspension disparities addressed in our board goals. But those are just my personal feelings, and I'll open it to any of my fellow board members. Shamiko or Amy, do you have anything you'd like to share?
Well,
Sorry, keep going, Amy.
sorry, I was just going to say, I agree with you, Melissa, that we do need to track data on suspension rates and how that is made up of, you know, who is being suspended in our schools. And I don't know if that lives under, I don't want to say bias, incident, and data trends, but it is potentially a reflection of bias of staff members if we are disproportionately suspending historically underserved students.
Can we just say
You
the
know what?
truth? This is the kids of color. I'm sorry, Amy. Can we just say it? It's the students of
Yeah, no,
color.
absolutely. It is racism in our schools playing out and affecting families. And yes, students of color are being disproportionately disciplined in our schools, and we know that.
Actually, that's, excuse me, I just really want to correct that. That's not accurate data. Our disproportionality with discipline is absolutely our students with disabilities. So it's important. I'm not saying that we don't have issues with bias in our schools, but it's really important to understand that when we talk about discipline data, the real significant disproportionality is students with disabilities.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think we, I have friends, and I think we all do, with students of color who have reported their children being disciplined when the people who are directing racism against them are not being suspended. So, that is happening in some of our schools, and obviously we want to see that addressed. When it comes to chronic absenteeism at the elementary level, I don't know how I feel about us tracking that. I think it is important, and obviously it's an academic indicator, but I guess I would want to know what tools do we have as a district to change that, since my assumption is that a lot of that is driven by poverty, housing instability, things that are outside of the students' control, and what can we do as a district to change that. So that would just be my comment about putting that as a metric.
I am okay with taking chronic absenteeism off, but I am not yet convinced about suspension rates.
The only assumption that I had in terms of this is in terms of the culture versus the incident report piece. How many families or students are choosing not to report the incident? I think that's critical to some of this, as well as some of the things we got to look at too. And is it a fear because they don't want to stand out, or the fear that they don't want to continue to have to talk about it, and have the families continue to experience it? Or what do we have in the sense of helping families understand, especially when students have gone through some of these reports, understand that they have supports and trying to help them as a family as well, too. And then the other thing I was looking at, and I think Shirley mentioned it and I were talking a little bit, it was about exit interviews in terms of staff, even, with some families that may leave too. And then also, what are we doing in terms of the wellness piece for staff, to be able to give them the ability to be able to function and do the necessary things they need? Whereas that's just an assumption I had.
I'd like to jump in there, Marcus. One of the things you just brought up, I think, is why it's crucial for us to have the perception data that captures individual data points from students that give us that perspective. And having, well, quite arguably for students, their 6 through 12 experience captured in Youth Truth data annually will give us good trend data on how that data set could migrate over time, just as the same way we would track the growth of students in their state assessment scores over time, we could see how those perceptions have changed over time as they go through middle school and high school.
I want to back up a second and say the fact that we gather this perception data, this is a new practice. And we brought this on 2 years ago. We asked for it 3 years ago. And am so excited that we're actually doing this. It's a really big step, and I think that one of the assumptions that people can make from that and see when they see that is that we are actually we're not just the ends, we're the means, and we're committed to looking at the experiences of our students, our families, and our staff in our schools. And I think that that's huge. Dave, help me with suspension. Where would it live? What, do we add it in an operations goal? What are your suggestions there if we want to be able to look at that? which would also give us actual hard data, and then we know what we're looking at.
Yeah, I don't know. I was actually running that question through my mind while you said that, but I don't know the answer to that. I mean, clearly, suspension data are important data for us to track as a system. That's not in question. Does it fit neatly into any of these three ends? I don't think so. Others may think that it does fit neatly somewhere. But yeah, I don't know. The idea that kids are not getting suspended from school means that they're experiencing wellness and inclusion. It's a little bit of a stretch too.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with I have been convinced on attendance and on discipline data. And again, you and I have had this conversation, but suspension data, the cream of the crop data, if you were really going to track this, is time out of class. Mm-hmm. But that's not something we're in the position to track. Yeah, you've convinced me on they're not the right, they're important measures, they're not the measures of this board end, but I still am and maybe Superintendent Cook has an idea. I do feel like when we're looking across each of these indicators and trying to address the gaps in experiences that were revealed in the equity and excellence review process, I feel like this is a piece of data that we would like to see, not just as part of an overall dashboard, but that it's being looked at.
One thing, Melissa, I'd add, for example, one of the things that the board asked is that we give an update on restorative practices and our progressive discipline, and so I know that's the October workshop. I mean, these are all things that can be part, because it's definitely that's part of a strategic initiative, and so as part of that report, annually to be looking at suspensions and things like that make a lot of sense.
Do you think we can maybe put it under the bias incident report or just under incidents in general? Because it's an incident because it's a suspension, so they had an incident had to happen.
And we definitely track that and talk about that internally, so there's not a problem with looking at that as well.
You mentioned as a part of an operational goal, these are all student outcome goals, right? These are things that we want students the reason the goals exist are they're what we see as outcomes that we think will be beneficial for students. Suspensions are something that we should be reporting on every year. Exit interviews with our staff that are leaving that would fit in an HR presentation annually. The student suspension data would be something we should present on every year as a part of our annual report, if you will, on the student experience. But I think the core of this goal is about voice and student belonging. And they're the ones that are going to tell us that explicitly with the way they report to us through surveys. It's voice and belonging of our staff. They're going to tell us through exit interviews, through feedback mechanisms. The last year was the first year we did the DEI staff experience survey. That data needs to be memorialized and reported upon annually, and it could very easily live in some of those operational parts of the board's goals and doesn't have to live in the student voice and experience, because I think we're going to have great systems in place to capture that perception data, just like Dave mentioned. That system will be in place, and that system is going to inform our decision making. We could very easily bake those in as a measure of performance indicators of our HR presentation annually or our student discipline presentation annually, and make that be a report out that comes to you all every year.
So here's what I'm thinking. Appreciate that, thank you. As with some of the other pieces, it lives in two places. One is that it's just part of the data that's reported in the restorative practices, like Dr. Nordquist mentioned. And then I think the last piece for us is identifying really for goal 4, which is our operational goal. What is our dashboard plus that the board just gets walked through every year, and that includes everything that's on the Oregon dashboard for our district, but perhaps has a couple of other pieces. Or we have that dashboard, but we've identified a couple of pieces that the board is interested in seeing when the HR report comes up, or the RJ, Jennifer, or not really Jennifer's work, but you know what I'm saying. Yeah.
You're right.
How does that sound to my fellow board members?
I think that's a really good point, Melissa. Again, there's lots of things that we have questions about. When you're looking at data, what is the question? What is it you really want to know? And then to whom are you going to report that? I would like to ask that last question as we wrap up. Us?
Well, we, as a board of directors, are reporting to the public. So I think that that's really the goal of the objective of solidifying the board goals and the measures is to really make sure that the public knows what we are working on in our capacity as elected officials for the Bentley Pines schools. And second, that these are the things that we are working on, and they are the things that Superintendent Cook then is working on, and that we are evaluating his work, because that is the model that we have.
And I would just add, I think it's crucial to establish clarity along the lines of that expectation, because you're accountable to the voters. I'm accountable to you, and the system is therefore it creates the pivot that we would turn to the system and say, these are our values. This is what we believe are going to be the right things to report on that indicate what it is that we are focusing our work on.
So I'm picturing a big annual report.
I would guess because it all doesn't come together at the same time, I'm guessing that we'll have a bunch of reports at different times of the year.
Okay, and actually preferable. And again, it allows us as a board and as staff to talk about the assumptions and the conclusions that the kind of reports we put out can have, both positive and negative. And I think it's tough to do, but I'd like to see us have a way to get to every school's PTO or PTA, and staff also, with some of those assumptions and conclusions that we have come to from that data. So it's a big project. Dave laughed when I said, about this thick. But it is a lot of data, and I think we need to really refine who needs to know what and how we present it.
Yeah, I can assure you that it's not going to take long for our system to start to hear and understand that these goals now have measures attached to them, and that you come back to that statement, the system movements for schools that provide clear, high-quality evidence of schools' efficacy of their work. That is a very clear, I remember vividly when I was a principal, knowing what those expectations are outside of me, that give me a way to focus our work and our expectations within the schools. And so there will be lots of dialogue around this and lots of clarity, because we've established this agreed upon set of parameters that we say matter to the student experience and the academic achievement that we want for each kid.
So if I'm going to recap, what I'm hearing, Dave, is that on goal 1, we are good to go. On goal 2, the board is in agreement to remove 2D. And then on goal 3, we would like to split out goal 3B to have one that's on absolute and one that's on closing the gap, and that we are okay with removing goals 3C and 3D from that outcome. And then
Somewhere in an operational,
that lives somewhere in an operational goal.
well, at least for suspension.
At least
Right.
attendance, I would say attendance as well, because that's financial with the ADM.
Okay.
And then that revised draft, then we will actually vote on at our next board meeting. Not our next board meeting, not the special one, our next regular board meeting. We will vote on it and put it into action. Does that sound good, everyone? Yeah? All right. Fantastic. Dave, thank you so much. I have so enjoyed, well, here, I'll wait. I'll put them into board. I will move us into the last piece, which is board comments. I'll go first. First, I want to appreciate Dave Van Loo and just the movement from assessment into really being the director of this strategic work is fantastic to have you in this role, and I've just really appreciated the thought partnership on this over the last 3 years. And then I also want to appreciate Superintendent Cook and Board Clerk Janet Wojciechowski. The three of us, gosh, not much more than 6 months ago, went to a bunch of the same sessions at the National School Board Association Conference. And over, what we saw in panels of districts was the key to their work was in having closely aligned goals between the board, between the leadership, and with the superintendent evaluation. And I feel like the work that, Steve, you led last year with your cabinet, the work that we've done as a board, and then the work that we've done together for the superintendent evaluation has really put us in that place. And I'm just really thankful for all of the thought partnership with this team and with our entire board who are thought leaders on this to get us to this place. So thank you. Are there other board comments?
Just quickly, last week, the Senate voted and confirmed my appointment to the State Board of Education, so it is official, and I will start this next month.
This is very exciting. And Shamiko is still a board member for us, too. All right. Our next regular school board business meeting is scheduled for October 11th, 2022. With that said, this meeting is adjourned.
Is this on?